say to the other, hey, if that happens. Otherwise, everything should be very good. Now, the PowerPoint,
So I'll have this to give to people. That's what you like to do. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TAFAF Coffee Talks. I'm so pleased to have you here for this terrific panel on sculpture and intimacy. And just the slightest bit of housekeeping. First of all, there are other panels coming up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They're in this cultural brochure. So I hope you'll have a look at it and see what else you might like to do. The other piece of housekeeping is that, as you can see, this is a restaurant. So at the end of this talk, we must stop by 11:30 and leave the room. So if you have more questions or thoughts that you would like to share with our wonderful panelists, you can take those conversations out into the hall. We'd really appreciate that. TAFAF Coffee Talks, as I said, goes on every morning in this space at 10:30. We view the fair not only as a venue for great art, but as an opportunity to rigorously examine through our cultural programming issues related to the art. We bring together here dealers, curators, collectors, and other art professionals to speak about art with knowledge and passion, which we have been so pleased that every panel has been such an incredible success because of the outstanding participants that we have been able to bring together. So I'm going to introduce our moderator now. We'll get started. Emerson Bowyer is Searle Associate Curator of European Painting and Sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago. Emerson, take it away.
Hi, good morning. It's great to see a good turnout. I woke up this morning and there was a little bit of rain and I was worried, but it sort of cleared up immediately. I'm just thrilled to be here on this panel with such distinguished guests. And we are all here to discuss sculpture and intimacy. You know, we often think of sculpture as being a purely monumental medium, the sort of thing you see on a gigantic scale in public squares and in churches and things like that. But there's a long history of people engaging with sculpture in quite different ways, in homes, these days in museums and smaller galleries. And they encourage very different forms of engagement on the part of viewers. And so I really wanted to sort of get down and dirty with those sorts of ideas today, with some collectors, dealer, curator, and we'll get a variety of perspectives, I think. I think to begin with, we might ask each of our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves so we can get started.
I'm Alan Darr. I'm the Senior Curator of European Art in the Walter, oh, sorry. Seemed like a familiar, very informal setting, but I'm Alan Darr. I'm the curator of, Senior Curator of European Art and the Walter B. Ford Curator of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working at the DIA, where it's for more than 30 years, and have, I think, been able to acquire some wonderful sculptures and decorative arts, working closely with some other collectors and patrons in the community, and we've had the support of various directors. So I look forward to talking about what motivates me and the passion I have for collecting and working with others to inspire them to collect. I've formed various support groups and patron groups where we have educational programs and seminars on connoisseurship and bring in speakers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Frances?
Hello, I'm Frances Beatty, and I wear a couple of hats, an art dealer and a collector. I ran Richard Feigen and Company for 35 years, and I've started a firm with my son. But the reason I'm here is because I collect things that I don't usually deal in with my husband, Alan Adler, and we met Emerson and engaged with him over the David Danger show, which started our relationship to Emerson, so I'm delighted to be here with him.
Hi, I'm Jon Landau, and I'm a collector of originally, well, of old master painting, and then inevitably, and really my focus for many years now is Old Master sculpture, Renaissance and early Baroque, and I'm here to share my perspective as it comes up here in conversation.
I think the only reason I'm here is because I know these people. I'm Dino Tomasso from Tomasso Brothers Fine Art, which was founded in 1993. I'm a dealer. We've specialized over the last 10 to 15 years in sculpture, mostly known for Renaissance sculpture.
And I just realized that sort of fortuitously, Dino does kind of resemble Michel Vollard. And I'm sure if you drop by his gallery any day of the week, you can see him fondling a small-scale sculpture. Well, my first question is a very basic one, but it's a very important one, and that is, why sculpture? So we might maybe start with Frances or Jon as collectors.
Well, my interest, starting in the late 70s when I first started collecting in other areas, was painting. And I gradually sort of drifted into back in time. I had started with American modernist painting in the late 70s and had a wonderful collection, but my taste kept going back and back and back. And so I became, tremendously interested in collecting Italian Renaissance and early Baroque painting. I really didn't look at the sculpture. My walkthrough of a museum ended when the paintings ended. And one day I was sitting at a table with a few similarly interested friends, and we somehow had gotten into a discussion about what is the greatest painting at the Frick Museum. And lots of fun with that topic. And then a sculpture dealer and scholar, really, the late Tony Roth was at the table. And Tony said to me, the next time you're at the Frick and you're looking at Rembrandt's Polish Rider, which was then in dispute, the attribution, but this is my favorite painting there. And he said, if you take 3 steps back, you're going to bump into a great piece of sculpture. And he said, why don't you turn around, idiot, and take a look at it? And I can truthfully say that was the beginning for me. And then I thought to myself, oh, this is fabulous, because I travel a lot in Europe, and I've seen incredible number of museum and other collections of paintings, and I realized I'm going to be able to go back to all of them now and start all over again with the sculpture. And that's what I've done. So that's how I came to it,
And it's interesting because there has been for at least a century now kind of primacy of painting, and I think that in the last couple of decades that's really starting to shift, and perhaps it has to do with availability of objects people are really starting to look more carefully at sculpture. How about you, Frances?
Well, I was trained as an art historian. I was thinking about this. Pictures of pictures are more satisfying than pictures of sculpture. So I think that we tend in art history to show people lots and lots of slides, photographs of paintings, as opposed to sculpture. And the sculpture we show does tend to be always daunting. It's on Gothic cathedrals. It's in large monumental situations. So I think, funnily enough, as an art historian, though I loved Romanesque and Gothic sculpture, it was because I traveled around and looked at it. And when Alan and I started collecting, we started collecting drawings and prints. And we had a friend, actually, who collected metals. And Alan was looking at this metal and that this friend of ours had a small collection of. And he said, I really want this. And our friend said, it's not for sale. And Alan, being Alan, said, I'm just going to take it home for a little while. And if you figure out a price, let me know. And so he brought it home. And we started looking at metals. And then we started looking at small-scale sculpture and really fell in love with the medium. And we are really... I mean, eclectic is really an understatement because we have Etruscan things, we have medieval things, we have 19th century things, so we can't seem to help ourselves. But I think it was that eureka moment in which, even though I'd been around this my entire life, I said, gee, this is something I can really have a really great relationship. We both did.
Yes, please.
Just to add on to Frances, I was also trained as an art historian and had the good fortune to study here in New York at the Institute of Fine Arts at a time when there were really wonderful professors who were passionate about sculpture. Of course, painting was primary, but there's always the paragone of which was more difficult or more interesting, the sculpture or the painting. And at the time I was there was a brilliant teacher named Katja Weil-Garris-Brandt, who was a very passionate, wonderful lecturer, who taught Renaissance. There was Olga Rajo, who taught Baroque. I took a class where we had to go to the Frick collection and be able to handle, and with gloves then, on the table where they took these off view, and also at the Metropolitan Museum down in a storeroom. So get to feel that tactility of sculpture and holding it in your hand and turning it around, something you can't appreciate the beauty of a work of art in 3 dimensions as a sculpture if you don't, in a way, hold it or at least move around it to appreciate its beauty. And I think, and then later I had John Popenessy, and H.W. Jansen, so I had wonderful mentors, and then I later worked in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum with a man named Tony Radcliffe and Charles Avery and Terence Hodgkinson, all of whom are great authors and specialists, several deceased now, but great. They motivated me to go into the field of European sculpture.
Brilliant. And Dino, how do you try to connect people with, or potential collectors with, sculpture? Is it different to showing them paintings? Is it a little harder to show people what is special about the 3-dimensional object?
It is actually. I mean, we're fortunate to have Jon here, who is really what I would call a Renaissance man, because he has a lot of the ethics of and the aesthetics of what I would call a true sculpture lover. You immediately, when you're showing Jon something, the first thing he does is touch. It reaches out, and it's all to do with that tactility. You know, the ancient Romans, the Greeks, and even the cultures before that had made small-scale sculpture that you could pick up and touch. But it was basically in the Renaissance that they started to actually make things to be picked up and touched. So we always encourage the client or the collector or the connoisseur or the director or the curator to actually touch the pieces of sculpture. It does make a big difference when you pick something up. And when you're learning about sculpture, you can pick a bronze up, because we normally deal in bronzes, we're mostly known for that. But you can pick a bronze up that's made in the 16th century, you can pick the same model up that's made as a copy in the 19th century, and it's the best way of learning. And I mean, I've brought some bronzes today to show, but if anybody wanted to pick up the Antinuous and have a look at it and hold it around, they're very welcome. It's a great way of learning. You learn to pick it up, turn it underneath, learn about its facture, and its weight, its quality, its patina, the way it's chiseled after the casts.
Can I just jump in? One point there, and also talking, as Francis was, about painting and sculpture, is that painting is easier by far to represent in photographs. Sculpture, three-dimensional sculpture in the round, can't be represented by a single photo, but that is primarily what exists and how it is handled. And once you become involved in it, as you say, tactily, and but also just the importance of, I mean, paintings, we tend to find there's a limited range of ideal positions to look at a painting from, whereas sculpture, there's a multitude of views, and which can't, until recently, modern technology is helping now, but if you're looking through a sculptured text, basically you're seeing one photo of an object that cannot be encompassed in a photo, so.
I was thinking about that cinematic aspect to looking at sculpture, and I was also thinking about there is this element of surprise when you look at it, and then as you move around it, you're like, wow, that's entirely a different way of looking at it, and that's a kind of nifty action that happens, I think, when you're looking at sculpture. And also the thing about picking it up, you're like, wow, that weighs whatever. So there is that, it gives you this little frisson every time you pick it up.
I would even add that, turning, in some cases, you can turn it over, you see what it looks like underneath, the way there's a lot of, if it's very thick in the way it's hard, not the right word, but the way it's cast is very important, and it helps you to do, once you begin to study this and talk to dealers and talk to collectors and begin to, that's one of the wonderful things about this fair and other fairs like this, where you have learned people that come in that are either private collectors or, knowledgeable dealers, and you have a dialogue that goes on, and you talk to each other, you can turn things over, you can hold them so they capture the light. And so getting a sense of the light is very important to see how the eyes are created or how the toes are created. That could be a very way of telling about the attribution of the work of art to a certain artist.
And these are all wonderful things in this context and in the context of a private collection. But what do we do in museums, Alan? I mean, we take, for example, medals, which Francis collects, of course, and which each of our museums has medals. These are relatively small, two-sided objects. Do you display them like a painting? In which case, how do you see the other side? How do you replicate that moment of turning something in the palm of your hand, or even feeling it warm in your hand as you hold it, as metal will tend to do?
Well, we probably can't do that in a museum, unfortunately, but I have been able to display either Renaissance medals, particularly Renaissance or Baroque medals, but they're also great 19th century medals. And when there is a front and a back, or an obverse and a reverse, we can display them on a plexiglass sheet in a case, so you can go around the case, ideally, and see the front and see the back. There are also, unfortunately, sometimes there are occasions when you can only see one side. We try to show out the most distinctive side. You could show it in a photograph, but you don't have the same pleasure of holding it in your hand that a collector, a dealer, or on a special occasions a curator can have.
I can't resist. I just
and a good one too.
This is a David d'Angers of Jericho, which Emerson borrowed from us for his Jericho show. Sorry, I can't do, even I can't do this. But, so this is, I just thought I would show you something. Alan will hold it up, and then a Galeotti medal that we have at home, which has a wonderful reverse. And I wanted to say, the thing about pictures is, I notice when I talk to people about pictures, that they stand back. And even if I say, go up a little closer, go up a little closer, people are very reluctant to get really close to works of art. But when you have sculpture, you've got to get up close to it. And it doesn't spoil the illusion. Sometimes if you look at a painting, you get very close to it, you can't see it anymore. But if you get really close to the sculpture, you see it better. So I think that idea of, you know, really being involved in it is true for the medium.
The question of displaying sculpture at home is very is a real learning experience. And in our home, the sculpture and the painting are completely integrated into all the spaces where the art is. There's not a picture gallery and a sculpture gallery. However, museum convention has been much more towards dividing painting, sculpture, and even decorative, and into these somewhat isolated viewing categories. And once you've had the active mix of painting and sculpture, and you know that's what you're living with, and that's your norm, it seems very hard to understand the general museum convention. The National Gallery of Art in London, one of the greatest institutions in the world, but it just has paintings. And then to see the sculpture, you've got to go to the Victoria and Albert and the other locations where it is. It is not a natural. That's something that evolved for other reasons than it being beneficial to the viewer. You know, and when we go to our great churches in Italy, of course, the mix of sculpture and painting is continuous. So that's what my wife Barbara and I have tried to do at our home. That's what works for us, so that there's no boundaries in that respect. You know.
Absolutely. I was just going to ask Dino quickly, what sort of strategies do you use to display sculpture? Do you try to give a sense of what a sculpture might look like in a home, or a home environment, or?
The main time that we're on show is normally at a fair, and we like to try and, we're very fortunate with this building. It's by far the best fair that we do with the purpose of showing how things can be displayed in somebody's own home and environment. We're fortunate to have one of the rooms upstairs, so you can create the ambience, which can be repeated at home as well. But for me, we always try to create an atmosphere where when you walk onto a stand or when you come into the gallery, it feels very intimate straight away. So you walk immediately up to a piece of sculpture and you feel you can touch it straight away, because it is such an important way of learning. That's the way that we try to encourage people to look at sculpture. And I must say that what Jon was saying about the paintings and mixing the paintings with the sculpture, Jon does it perfectly, and it's all accessible. Unfortunately, you can't in the institutions; it's not possible. But you know, whenever anybody gets a chance to visit a collector or come to an art fair, most dealers will let you pick something up and become up close and personal with it, and then that is by far the best way that you can learn about sculpture. Then you can always take the imagination of how it would look in your own home, and take it onto a different level, personally.
I would like to say that our institution is different, that we go back to 1885, but we're very fortunate in 1921, Wilhelm Valentiner, or William Valentiner, came from Berlin, and he firmly believed, as did Bode, and the importance of showing galleries with, notably, particularly in showing paintings and sculpture, maybe sometimes furniture, but Valentina took it a step further and believed in showing the entire cultural epoch by demonstrating, by having on the walls and in the galleries and cases, painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. Always, so as you go through time, you'll see in every gallery we have, or nearly every gallery, we don't just isolate the paintings in one hand and the sculpture in another, as they do more or less at the Metropolitan Museum, certainly at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, but we have, I think, very handsome galleries. Valentina also created an architectural ambiance, so you have a sense of the architectural atmosphere, whether it's Gothic or Renaissance or Baroque. And so I invite you to, if you haven't been to Detroit, we've renovated the museum just a few years ago. It looks wonderful, and there are great galleries, each showing painting, sculpture, and decorative arts as you move through time.
I think this is sort of the wave of the future, because we all were very, very excited when Keith Christensen had the big portrait show at the Metropolitan Museum, Renaissance Portraiture, and he integrated all of this sculpture, metals, and I think that it is something that is being noticed by institutions who are going to follow your example and mix them all up together.
Well, at the Metropolitan, which is basically has a tradition of a segregationist tradition, but there are small attempts at experimenting, and if you go to the Spanish painting gallery, where the great El Grecos are, among other things, there are these pair of busts by Pedro de Mena and a great Barraquete sculpture that have been integrated into that room, and they're of a similar date, and all the works in the room are Spanish, and it gave a fantastic lift to that room and just was a obvious prototype of what could happen. The thing is that when you live with a mix of painting and sculpture, I can think back to when we didn't have any sculpture, and I couldn't even imagine, not collecting both. It doesn't make any. In the course of a year, I always. I bought a painting yesterday. I continue on both fronts, but I think institutionally that the model that you're working with it's just the most intelligent way to deal with it.
Can I just point out that the painting that John bought yesterday is a very sculptural piece of painting.
Exactly.
And John's collection is, over the last decade, last 10, 15 years, has become very sculptural in its paintings attitude.
And Dino's a little upset because I didn't buy it from him.
But what
I don't
about
like to mix friendship and business.
What about, Francis, mixing sculptures from different time periods? This is not something, and sculpture and other media from different time periods, which is not something that we're necessarily, it's not the model that we follow at museums. We tend to be very historical and contextual, and Francis does something quite different.
Alan and I are fully integrated. And when I was at graduate school, I studied 19th and 20th century European and American, and my minor was early Italian Renaissance. So the idea of sort of just keeping to one place was always anathema to me. And when I say Alan, it's my Alan, not this Alan.
Live in the same thing.
But we would buy a metal, and then the next thing we'd see would be a wood sculpture, a pear wood sculpture. And because we were doing it and collecting it, it didn't occur to us not to then buy an ivory. And also, it's always, for a private collector, it's such an interesting journey that we were on together, because it wasn't something that I specialized in. So we would get to know dealers like Dino, who have such knowledge. And I also think that the sculpture people, because they were kind of balkanized, and because there's a slightly, there's a smaller group of them, they're a lot friendlier. They're sort of like, wow, one more sculpture collector, whoopee. You're like, you make a difference in being added. So that's a really nice thing.
I think that one thing we must always remember is that what Francis touched upon there is that over the last few years everybody's talked about mixing the old with the new and things like that. You must remember that in the Renaissance, when the Renaissance collector, connoisseur, was having his portrait painted by the man who was contemporary to him, obviously, he was collecting things that were 1,500 years older. So mixing the old with the new, as they say, is not a new thing, and it's always been done. If you can, fortunate to be able to do it with taste, it works wonderfully. And I'm not sure that any of the museums have done it recently in permanent displays. I know they've done it in exhibitions, but in permanent displays, not sure how far away that is. But it's not a new thing, and the way that Francis displays her collection, I'm sorry I've not seen Francis and Alan's collection yet, but the way Jon displays it, Jon displays also 19th century Barbizon school paintings with, a 15th century piece of sculpture. So it's not, what Jon is doing is carrying on a tradition, and I'm sure Francis the same, carrying on a tradition that started 600 years ago.
Well, that speaks to, as a private collector, you realize you're not trying to create a mini museum effect. You do, the Italian school, the Spanish, all of this. You have in a home, you don't have any reason to observe those conventions, just like the convention of separating painting and sculpture. And so this is very liberating. And what you really wind up with, because I'm always saying, well, what am I looking for? And I describe to myself, or sometimes to dealers, specifically what I'm looking for. And then I always wind up buying something that I just wasn't even thinking about, because I see it. And so you're not, my goal is that the unification of the collection, and you want to feel that it's unified in some way, but the unity comes over time from the collector demonstrating and exhibiting a point of view. The point of view is in progress. You're developing your point of view as you become more deeply enmeshed in the whole morass of all this great work. But ideally, when I look at the collection and with all of its individuality and juxtapositions that we sort of invent as we go along, you come away with a distinct experience. We're not trying to replicate how it is done someplace else. You're trying to invent a way of presenting everything.
It's much more personal in your own home. It's much more personal. So
Absolutely.
You have the freedom to do anything, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's not the same in the institutions.
Well, and getting back a little to Francis's discussion of wood versus metal, I'm quite interested in, are there specific materials that speak to you all personally? Sculpture achieves completely different effects based on what materials are used, and some seem more intimate than others, and I'm kind of interested in that.
Well, I'll speak to that first, but anyone else is welcome. I think for me, I've often found that terracotta has an immediacy. It's similar to a drawing in that it's the original often the original concept of the artist working out an issue, and that may then lead on to the marble, even an original, something called an original plaster, which is like a terracotta, but is the first in a series of what later develops into another medium. But I found that original terracotta or bozzetti, whether it's Italian or French, or sometimes you find English, and there were quite a few in the fair, has a very great immediacy. We've been talking about sculpture pretty much in a sort of in a generic term, but there's polychrome wood sculpture. We've been looking. There's a lot more of that, I think, on the market. It's certainly a lot more in this fair than there used to be, and in Maastricht, particularly Spanish, but also other German polychrome wood sculpture. Ivories, unfortunately, we can't acquire or import right now. There's another field that I think, helped to open up, and that's porcelain sculpture. There are various figures that are made out of porcelain. We bought a collection of Doccia porcelain, which is made in Florence. It was the very first porcelain sculpture in Italy after it was invented in Meissen and then moved to Vienna. Then because of Vienna, it came down to Italy. But marble, plaster, bronzes are particularly wonderful. But I guess my greatest love is original terracotta models.
It's strange.
John?
It's strange to think that in our field, when we're dealing with specific collectors, we have specific collectors for specific mediums. So we have collectors who only buy bronzes. To me, that's quite something I can't quite get my head around because you know, sculpture. Ivory is much warmer than bronze. It's beautiful and tactile to touch. Unfortunately, like Alan said, it's impossible these days in the United States. Bronze, you have to think about that there's more of the idea of manufacturing and going in the process, and there's lots of different workmen and artists and craftsmen involved in that. Then small-scale marbles, they're far and few between that you can actually pick up and handle. But I think Alan touched on exactly the point. The most tactile of all would be a terracotta. They like John used to collect some drawings, and Francis has some drawings, I think. They're the immediate ideas of the artist, and they come across really well. And you can feel, in terracotta, you can even find the thumbprints, of the artist, and it's a real intimate feeling that you get from a small-scale terracotta, and of course that anybody's able to pick a small-scale terracotta up as well.
So John and I were saying before, when I said I don't really want more people to collect medals, because as a collector you really don't want any competition, and John said, I'm going to tell everyone how terracottas break and that they shouldn't buy them.
A good point.
By the way, John collects terracottas. Yeah.
I bought a terracotta model by the artist Ercole Ferrata a couple of years ago, and it was really a funeral monument. It was a little model for it, this big, as loose as can be, just a gorgeous thing, and incredibly free and energetic. And the 15-foot high marble that this was a study for is in Rome. I forget which church, but and it didn't have anything much else in it. But I go to see it, and I just couldn't stand the incredible coldness and stiffness of the official version. And the terracotta, which is, people will say, some people say, well, it's the Rubens oil sketch versus the Rubens monumental picture, but it is of such a free medium, and of course we've had so many great sculpture exhibitions in the last few years, but there was the John Bologna terracotta exhibition here, and then I mean, excuse me. Okay. Well, you know, they both have a B in them. That's and then in Terracotta we had this phenomenal, I thought, exhibition in Boston of the Della Robbia, which was just one of the best curated, lit. It was perfection, and you know, the whole business of the technique of the Della Robbias as it was displayed was completely eye-opening. I mean, everybody who's interested in sculpture has some familiarity with the Della Robbia, but to put it in this perspective was, I still go on about it because it was such a lifting experience. Anyway, I like Terracotta.
And it was interesting, I like Francis's comment that, you know, old terracotta's going to break. Because it also brings another issue to the fore, which is that sculptures have lives, and as objects, they have often very visible lives. And I was wondering, for each of you, to what extent is the visible, whether it be literally or figuratively, the patina that an object develops over time, the wear and tear, the accidents that occur, to what extent do those personal histories of objects start to be part of the attraction to you when you engage with sculpted objects?
Our aesthetic in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and I can't speak any before that because that's when the photographs basically started to come out, but the bronze on the end of a model which is called the porcellino. Now we think it's a beautiful looking object. It's got a beautiful soft patina. You can see all the chiseling, and it's a lovely example of how we would like to see it. It's not garish. When that bronze was made, it was very, very bright. It looked a totally different thing. It was meant to be seen like a jewel. It was a bright copper color when it was first made, but our aesthetic is used to understanding and being pleased with the way it looks these days because the oxidization and the patina and people rubbing it, and it's toned down many, many times to what it originally looked like. It's not necessarily the same for the one on the right because that's mimicking an ancient bronze. So that was made to look very dark and green and things like that. But all the 17th century bronzes were really, really bright. And so it is a very different aesthetic, how we understand them, to exactly how they were manufactured and when they were made and when they were sculpted.
I think you hit on a nerve, because when we collect sculpture and we see the sort of nicks, a Madonna that has no more arm or this, that, and the other, it does remind you of the passage of time and of your kind of being one link in a long, in a kind of history. And there is this really kind of wild ego thing that happens to you when you buy things, or even when you sell them as a dealer. You kind of feel like you're part of it. You get some of the, whatever it is, the spirit of that thing, and you feel like it's, you get a little attached to it in some way. So when somebody looks at this sculpture, they don't just think of how wonderful it is, but they think you're kind of niftier because you own it and you bought it. And you think that too. I mean, wildly enough. It's actually one of the reasons I think why we collect things is, and we also become part of not just their world, but the world of the people that know about them, which is a wonderful thing. You meet the collectors, the curators, this. So you become part of this group of people who are appreciating these things.
I might just add that you talked about sculpture as a life, but its life is much, much longer than ours. And I saw this very beautiful Egyptian two-seated figure of the goddess of Mut, and next to her is another figure that's all been defaced because that was someone that fell out of favor, so they took away all of his or her identification, and it's 5,000 years old and was over $5 million, and it's here in the fair. But there's ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, and even I generally believe personally that if you find a terracotta or a original plaster, it's almost better, unless it's very dirty, to leave it, as they say in French, dans son jus, or in its original patina. Similarly for bronze, sometimes things get too, they've lost their color, and particularly you find it in wooden sculpture, in Spain, for example, that sculpture was conventionally repainted every couple of generations, and sometimes that can be taken back to the original, but more often than not, they've done a good job, and you basically respect the sculpture for what it is and treasure the paint that is old and the paint that has been added to the surface. It depends on the nationality.
I think from the collecting point of view, you get to a place where you sort of have to assess for yourself, is that missing arm or missing nose or missing foot, or in some cases all three missing in the same object, at what point are you, at what point do these historical signs of life, signs of long life, injuries, become too distracting? For me, as a viewer, there are things that people more expert than me appreciate totally in the form that they're in, that for me, I find, it's a little too, it's got a little too much of a certain kind of history. And then the role of how to approach the conservation of objects and what the boundaries are for where to intervene, which inevitably, if you collect paintings and you collect sculpture, you over time develop a point of view about conservation. As you were just saying, that intervening as little as possible and accepting the history of the object is philosophically the point of view. But it's a one at a time situation. You're dealing with a single object at a time, and yeah, so it's actually just part of the process, and it's part of the enjoyment, is thinking about and doing your best to be, as you were suggesting. We get to be owners, collectors, but really we're owners / custodians. I mean, the life of the object is certainly not going to end when we unhappily end ourselves. John's touched on a great point there, because it's really funny, as a dealer, if we find a fantastic piece of 19th century sculpture that is in the same state as a piece of sculpture from the ancient world, it's unsaleable. It's completely unsaleable. So if you find a head that's half missing, nobody on the planet will buy it from you. But if you find a head, a Roman head, that's half missing, you can sell it as long as it's in good, as long as it's got a good gaze or a good image or something like that. So that's always, I think people do tend to respect the older an object is, the more you do expect it to be damaged, and you have to accept that it comes down to us as it is. Whereas the 19th or 20th century things, much less. And it becomes part of its romance in a way. Absolutely, when it's older. Yeah. Have any of you ever been surprised by the ability of a particular object to connect with people? Have you ever had an object and been utterly taken aback by the way that others respond to it?
Well, okay, I'll start. A couple of years ago, we found, I've been looking for a sculpture by Charles Cordier, who was the first, well, sort of in the 19th century, to want to represent the beauty in all the different races. And he was sort of the curator of ethnography at the Museum of Natural History in Paris. and he was also one of the earlier proponents of the invention of the electrolytic process. But he was interested in traveling, and he went to the Near East, he went to Greece, he went to Algeria, and while he was there, we came across a wonderful sculpture that was coming up at auction that had only been known through a photolithograph done in 1862, and it was a color lithograph from 1862 when it was exhibited in an international exhibition in London, but it portrayed a Mauresque African woman, very beautiful, and there was a whole story to this, and it turned out that on the one hand, when he went to Algeria, he gradually befriended the woman who lived next door and asked if he could do her portrait, which he did in terracotta, and then later when he moved back to Paris, he did this unique, very beautiful, multicolored bronze where he has a sort of a lace a jacket, a beautiful hair that's all knotted, done and then braided and gilded, and has some green patina, gold patina, and then beautiful bronze face, dark complexion. But we learned from the catalog in 1862 that underneath was he first silvered the bronze with the electrolytic process. So underneath the dark patina was a silver. The piece had gone, it darkened a bit, but there's a very fine conservator in England named Rupert Harris who said, I can make this, I can return it to its original beauty, and he very carefully removed sort of the grunge that had gotten into the crevices of the bodice, and then the darkness on the top of the patina to allow the silver, the skin color was all underneath silver, and then he added the darker patina because she was African. So we have this very beautiful African woman sculpture that when we put it out, people were just sort of mesmerized by this, and they fell in love with it. And it was the most beautiful thing, and it was right in the passageway where you go from one gallery to another. It was a gallery about the influences from afar, so the foreign influences in Near Eastern and Chinese and Asian. So that was one case in point. There are many others, frankly, but that's just one.
Alan and I bought a wax head of a monk, Stop it, Emerson.
No, I love it. I love it.
It was, the world is divided into the people who go, what? And you know, like, get me out of this room, and the people who say, wow. But it is wax, extremely lifelike, a little smaller maybe than human scale, and it's an old monk scene, very sallow, with like real hair, and it looks like thankfully the
looks
teeth
like
are
John.
not ivory. What?
Looks like John.
No. But anyway, it's hyper realistic, and it's we think incredibly affecting. But people that come in, it's a little like our sort of Halloween trick. I mean, we put a light on it, and people really are like, are you crazy? How could you have bought that? And then there are other people who are like, yeah, good for you. So that was definitely one of those.
I enjoy when we have visitors specifically coming to see the collection. And there's always a surprise. The first surprise for the visitor is how much we charge at the entrance.
By the way, there's a bus leaving outside at 11:45 to John's.
There's a little humor there. But what happens is you get to, they're being introduced to the collection and experiencing it, and you get to sort of feel the collection through their eyes for a little while, and you get a sense of there's certain points that are unpredictable. People will stop and really look over here, and the next person will just walk right past that, you know. But I have a small painting by Corot from 1826 of a milliner, a woman, a very charming woman who is holding a spool of thread, and is just a lovely picture. And we have many things of equal and even, you know, superior quality. But this has to be, I mean, everybody stops in front of this one picture. Whatever else they look at and don't look at, the one universal, I've seen people walk past some of our greatest objects and just not register, and, you know, you sort of scratch your head a little bit, but whatever, you know, and everybody stops for this, you know, so.
But most people who come to visit you are quite good connoisseurs, and I must say, you may have things which you feel are more artistically important, but I must say that is a beautiful object. So it really is. I do understand why people stop at it.
Absolutely, you know. But
when we display at the international fairs, about 10 years ago, it's fortunately here with a very great collector at the present time, but about 10 years ago we displayed in 3 or 4 fairs and a glass inlay, a marble tabletop with ancient Roman fragments inlaid into the top by Francesco Sibilio, the man who was a brilliant craftsman from the late 18th and early 19th century. And it was such an attractive thing that it was the only thing that people looked at. And now we have, since then we've displayed, we've done many different fairs, and we always have one object which has drawn everybody's attention. But I must say, this time we've displayed a portrait at the back of the stand, which is everybody looks at. But another thing which has surprised us has been a Romanesque piece of sculpture, which is quite dimly lit. It's been the most attractive thing on the fair stand. So it does surprise you sometimes how people react to things.
No, it's amazing. I think we're actually running out of time, so perhaps we could take some questions. 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has something. Yeah. Elise.
I'm curious if you, if anybody could speak to plaster as a medium, and I think we talk a lot at the Met about how plaster historically has been a kind of neglected medium among collectors or museums, kind of mistreated in a way, but in the last 10 years or so, plaster has become a medium that people are looking at afresh as a kind of serious artistic sort of medium, something to think about originality through.
To some degree. There's a fantastic Canova here made of plaster that was sold already. But Canova was really the first artist to believe in the importance of plaster as a medium to show the creative process. He did first work in terracotta. They were often cast into plaster, and then made into a larger scale, from which he would have the marble carved. But then he would preserve the beautiful compositions of it, the subtle carving of the hand, the subtle hand that Canova had. But he was famous for 2 things: this wonderful finish in the marble, but then also for using plaster as a medium both to create the marble, but also to make a copy of the marble. So Canova, in fact, I believe this marble was one of the ones that demonstrated the beauty of the composition. The marble is for a tomb that's in St. Peter's. We just recently bought a beautiful colossal bust by Canova in plaster that is of his best friend. The marble itself, there's only one. It's on the tomb that exists in Milan. But he's a very distinguished painter and artist. But this plaster, which it's very rare that they do come up, but they still preserve all the integrity of the original composition. They're beautiful works of art. They often have sometimes their original patina, or you can clean them somewhat. That's an issue. But I think plaster, particularly with Canova, in some cases of the 19th century, is a wonderful material that creates great sculpture, and it does appear. I've acquired a few original plasters by artists like Francois Rude and Barry, and we have some by Arp. So it's an interesting media, and I think a wonderful way to find great sculpture.
And it's also an incredibly experimental medium as well. And I've been working with Rodin a lot recently at the Art Institute, and never was there an artist, really, I think, who used plaster as such a major part of his process. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen those remarkable drawers. There are photos of them at the Rodin Museum, and you pull them out, and it's just 100 legs. And they would be used they were valued as fragments, I think, by Rodin, but they were also objects that he could imaginatively and sometimes literally piece together in different ways. So they also function very much in a kind of experimental, creative process way too.
We have in our inventory at the present time a small-scale maquette by Henry Moore, and it's called a crossed hatch figure. It's the only one he did. And it was cast in bronze from a model which he was making in plaster, and he scratched it all to adhere some more plaster. And he actually stopped and looked at it and thought, I actually like, it's known that he wrote this, that I actually like this as it is. So he cast the actual plaster to represent the plaster, not to represent the model that he was finally going to make, but just in bronze, the cast of the plaster that he loved because it was all cross-hatched.
Well, thank you all very much. I think that was it.
Thank you, Emerson.
Thank you very much for coming. I want to say that this beautiful booth that Dino has, Tomasso, is upstairs on the 2nd floor. So you can see everything,
Thank you.
all the words he said in situ up there on the 2nd floor. Please exit the room as quickly as possible. I'd appreciate if you take your coffee cups and napkins and whatever. Please take one of these with you if you can. And thank you, panel.
Shall we leave this?
Yes.